geographical restriction of movement, as it's called, until their case is examined. Those who are allowed to live in a number of mainland camps, mostly around Greater Athens, central and northern Greece, whilst the most vulnerable are accommodated in urban apartments through a program called Estia, which was originally initiated by the UNHCR, but has lately passed on to the Greek government with ever limited provisions and budget cuts. In the last couple of years or so, beneficiaries of international protection may also benefit from rent subsidies if they enroll with an IOM-run program called Ilios, the only so-called integration program in place at the moment, whilst those who don't either go for the open market, let's say, or a small amount among them may benefit from solidarity or informal self-provided housing. Recognized refugees in particular lose all sorts of provisions they may have enjoyed before their asylum claim was examined, and many may find themselves homeless if they don't enroll with Ilios or after that, or if their registration with that program ends. We've seen many returning back to camps to find temporary shelter. In theory, they are legally enjoyed access to the same kind of benefits as the general population, yet specific provisions, such as a certain number of years of residence in the country in order to be eligible, or certain income criteria that they cannot fulfill due to their cash assistance or special income support as refugees enrolled with Ilios, hinder them from receiving. So asylum seekers and refugees not only face housing precarity, amongst others, but also exclusion from available provisions at a time when the housing question, hence a component of the urban crisis, which is the theme, the topic of the conference, re-emerges in the Greek context, especially in cities. The Estia urban housing program, in particular, the one in urban apartments, despite several problems and deficiencies, appears to have worked fairly well, may have be seen as the main large-scale social housing initiative in the country that could pave the way for a realistic, viable and fair social housing policy, perhaps for all. And I'll leave you with this, and thank you very much for the attention. Would be happy to discuss.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Panos. I think one of the things that you've picked up there really nicely, and that I think comes across quite interestingly across the different programs and the kind of historical context that you're providing about the Greek case is a point that Lefertis, I think, mentioned this morning in his keynote, which is the kind of differential nature of crisis and the ways in which, you know, what we're actually talking about here are multiple different invocations of crisis that overlap, and the ways in which crises for one group or one section of an economy or an urban society may actually not be a crisis for others, but then become one for other groups. So thinking about that, the differential nature of the housing market and how that kind of response to austerity almost has produced challenges for other groups within society, and those kind of overlapping things. I know that one of the points that Romola, I think, mentioned right at the start of this introduction was around this question of how resources for one group opens up challenges and questions for others. So I think there's some really interesting kind of points that we can pick up on and hopefully reflect on further in discussion. So thanks very much for your contribution. I'm going to pass on now to our second speaker, and then we'll have time for further questions and discussion afterwards. So our second speaker is Angela Franco, Maria Franco Calderon, apologies, who is an associate professor at the Department of Architecture at the University del Valle in Cali, Colombia. So I'm going to pass over to Maria, to Angela, sorry, to give us some thoughts from the kind of Colombian context and reflecting on her work there. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Romola and Jonathan, for the presentation. I want to share my screen to show you some images about the topic I will address. If you can tell me if you are seeing now the
we can see that. Thank you.
Okay, I will be talking about free housing, a free housing program we had for internally displaced people in Colombia. And is the presentation okay? Second slide. Sometimes it doesn't work.
It hasn't moved on yet.
Okay. Wow.
It's not in presentation view at the moment. It's in kind of introduction view, as it were. I don't know if you can put it into slideshow.
Yes, I put it in full presentation mode, but I don't know what's happening.
Okay, we're on to the second slide now.
So is it okay?
Yeah, we're on to the second slide now, yeah.
But my presentation? No,
it's not in full slideshow, but it's viewable, well, it's visible, yeah.
Okay, let's try like that. And some of you must know that Colombia has a really, really long time internal conflict with paramilitary groups, guerrilla groups, and the military from the government that has caused a lot of conflict in rural areas and the movement of people displaced from rural areas to cities. This week I checked the numbers, the statistics from the government, and we have almost 9.2 million people displaced from rural areas to cities between 1985 and 2021, which make us the first country within the highest number of displaced people, internally displaced people in the world. And right now we are facing also the movement from the migration from Venezuelan, and we are the second country in the world receiving international migrants, refugees, with 1.7 million after Turkey, which is the first receiving 4 million people, around 4 million people from Syria. So I will be talking about solutions, the housing solutions proposed to host all these people coming to cities. And during the government of Juan Manuel Santos, the free housing program was a flagship program, despite criticism arising about the quality of the projects. He proposed and built actually 200,000 homes in main cities, mainly directed to victims of the armed conflict. And his speech in the launch of the program was really focused on the revitalizing construction sector. Here, the construction of social housing has been in charge of the private sector since the 90s. And he was talking about fostering economic growth during the launching of the free housing program. Not much about the benefits for victims or the benefits for the poor. Excuse me, Jonathan, but are my slides spicing?
So we're still on internal displacement in Colombia, the second slide.
Okay, I don't know why, because I have a lot of figures and photos, and I want you to.
Yeah, we've moved on now. Yeah.
So I will check. Is that working right now in this?
Yeah. So we're on slide 3 at the moment.
Okay, I will try without full screen. So it was focusing on fostering economic growth, this program openly in the president's discourse, but also it has a focus on building the political platform for a presidential candidate, Vargas Lleras, who was Minister of Housing during the first period of Santos and Vice President during the second period, and he was in charge of the program, and he was delivering homes all around the country. And I want to show you the kind of neighborhoods that were built during this initiative of the government for IDP. You can see in these pictures the low quality of the context. And these projects are mainly located, these pictures are from projects mainly located in the Caribbean coast. So you can imagine what that means, not having green areas or trees in these huge housing projects. So the quality was very, very low, and we don't know if it was a good solution for IDP people. And considering that in Colombia we have been building social housing for a long time, since the 90s, as I said, it was the private sector in charge of it. And during the last 2 decades before the program, we reduced the number of people living in informal settlements, but inequality increased. So we have more a program directed to build houses, but not to fight against inequality, which is a main problem of the focus of our program directed to IDP. And I was studying the case of Llano Verde, which is the only neighborhood built within the program of the free housing. Cali is the main center of commerce and services in the southwest of the country, is near the main port on the Pacific coast in Colombia. 98% of its 2.5 million inhabitants live in urban areas, so it's a highly urbanized city. And there is more than 36% people live in poverty, and nearly 200,000 IDP arrived between 1985 and 2021, and only 7% of them received a home in this neighborhood. And the neighborhood is populated by 98% of IDP. And it was built in the last corner of the city, in the poorest area, in the most violent area of the city, where Afro-descendants have been confined by social-racial segregation, and with the highest number of people unemployed. So when the government decides where to build the neighborhood, oh, well, when you see where it was built, you know that there were few considerations about social mixing or offering the people who will receive a home there different conditions for the poorest people in the city. And I was exploring for characteristics of urban marginality in Cali around my research, and I was analyzing there these 4 inherent characteristics that I call, which are ethno-racial segregation, informality, hyper-unemployment, and violence. And I found that it was a new neighborhood built fully by the state that were promoting social-spatial segregation practices. It was not intended, actually. If you can see here my maps, in the left, there is the map of the location of Afro-descendant people in the city, located, as I said, in the poorest parts. And on the right is a map I did for locating ethnic minorities, indigenous people, and Afro-descendants in the new project. It was a ballot system to distribute the homes, but apparently they choose ethnic minorities as prioritizing the delivery of the homes. And the result, the unintended result, was that the first groups with homes were the ethnic minorities, so they were confined to a corner of the neighborhood. Another effect of this kind of housing, with no retail spaces, with no options for business, disconnected from the economic areas, was the emergence of small businesses inside the homes, the small homes. So the family had to left a place of the home to put a business to survive, basically, or building more stories because the project didn't fit the size of the family, but also to use informal transport because the network of the city didn't cover very well the neighborhood. Another effect of not a good planning of this kind of projects was perpetuating structural and symbolic violence. Here I was locating the victims or the armed conflict living in this district. Most of them of course, located in the project, and most of them in the formal settlements. So it was a neighborhood recognized, it is a neighborhood recognized by the people from the city as a neighborhood for displaced people who are in the stigmatized, because people relate victims with collaborators of the guerrillas, collaborators of the paramilitary groups. So the stigma is really, really hard in the city, and they are all together there. Inside the neighborhood, and the personal violence has arisen since the very moment the neighborhood was occupied by the new residents. They have right now 3 gangs that control most of the space, as you can see here. Homicides related to gangs, to organized crime groups that for retaliations, for controlling space, drug trafficking. One of these gangs right now, the police is trying to check if they are becoming organized crime group. So the situation is very complicated right now in the neighborhood. To finish with my presentation, well, I want to say that the emergence of new forms of marginality in these kinds of neighborhoods built by the state for victims of their conflict is related with forms of domination really well positioned and concealed in discourses, which include economic growth, planning and development, but placed in a context of income disparity, racial discrimination, and social-spatial segregation that has been normalized both by the government and society. And now we had last year during the lockdown for COVID-19, 5 Afro-descendant youth were killed in January for trespassing private property just across the street in a sugarcane plantation. I show you that it's a peripheral neighborhood. I was analyzing all these cases in this book called Marginalidad Oculta, Concealed Marginality, related to these policies of free housing in Colombia. And it's not a coincidence that we had national strike and the worst riots in the history of Cali between April and June this year. Maybe some of you heard about these riots that lasted for 2 months with a food shortage and in the middle of the pandemic. So it's now, we are not facing these riots, but I think the problem has not been solved yet. So thank you very much. Now I'm finished with this.
Brilliant, thank you very much. That was really fascinating, and I'm really glad we got to see those slides, because they really helped to kind of contextualize, particularly the mapping, which was brilliant. And as a geographer, I always really appreciate mapping. So it was really nice to see the kind of spatial representation of these things. One of the things that struck me from that, and I think it's a point that we may kind of come back to through some of the other discussions, is around the kind of the sort of long-standing historical legacies that are underpinning that neighborhood, and the way that you were kind of talking through that in relationship to not just the kind of present stigmatization of residents there through the IDPs, but the longer term kind of processes of territorial stigma that attach to particular parts of the city, and why those marginal areas then become the focal point for segregation, but also kind of ongoing forms of displacement and kind of settlement, in some cases by kind of force or dispersal or containment, these kinds of things. So that was really fascinating to kind of think about those longer term overlapping legacies. Brilliant. So I'm going to pass now to our next speaker, and then we'll have time for further discussion later. And just to say, if you have questions from any participants, the chat function is disabled for this, but if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A, and then I'll be picking those up kind of when we come around to discuss at the end of our speakers. Okay, so our next speaker is Khondaker Hasibul Kabir, who is a community architect and a member of the Platform of Community Action in Architecture in Bangladesh, and also the Community Architects Network. So I'm going to pass over to Khondaker, whose the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I would also like to share a slide. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Yeah. Let me start. As Ramola sent us a few questions. I'll try to go address all those, not all those, but a few questions, and I'm going to share one specific project to elaborate what I'm going to say. So who are we? We are a network, and as mentioned, as you mentioned, that we are part of CAN, Community Architects Network, and POCA, Platform Community Action and Architecture, and we have a local practice that is co-creation architects in a secondary city of Bangladesh. And yeah, you can see the network of CAN network, and that is under Asian Coalition for Housing Rights is the bigger umbrella. Okay. So yeah, this is actually our question. That people make communities and cities, whether professionals like architects, planners are, present or not. So the question is, how can we professionals participate in people's city making process and co-create better cities? So this is you can see, Bangladesh map and the position of Jhenaidah city. And the photograph, you can see all the people, I mean, our team, including the mayor of the city, then NGO people, then community leaders, and the architects, community architects. We call ourselves community architects. And how we start, we from the very beginning we start citywide. It's not one by one. And we means from the very beginning, we try to make the team with community people and others, and start to start the mapping exercise, settlement profiling and other types of mapping, so that people get connected, people know what where they are and what they have and how many they are. And we started with low-income communities of this city. And people are, I mean, these women, young women, they are from the community, and they are actually making the GIS, boundary of their city, by using very simple app. And who owned this information? And they did collected all the information of 63 communities of this city. And this information or the data is owned by the community. That's why it's very powerful, because they know it. And after that, actually you see the municipality engineer, he is just not working, he's just helping. And we architects are also, helping how to do it. And the question was like, who decides, from where we start? I mean, it's not that we decide. It's the network. They decide that who to work and from where we should start. But anyway, we start from somewhere, from anywhere, where the people are ready. And we start with, getting together, saving together, saving money. And if it is a normal situation, and if it is a disaster or in a very crisis situation, we do it differently. Then map together. Community mapping is very important. Mapping is not, getting the information only. Mapping is knowing each other, connecting each other. The process is not the product. Is the process is important, and through this process, we know about many things in the community. Here they did all this map. It seems that maybe the professional architects but they did it. I mean, simple. We just taught them simple things like, oh, one grid is 1 foot, and they measured. If they can count, they can measure the whole community. Then they put layers of polythene and make the future plan. And after that, if they want to make housing, they try to find an appropriate financial model, and this financial model also can be an empowering model. It's not that money is coming from outside and again going outside, and some NGOs are getting bigger. It's not that. The citywide community network, they are getting bigger. The money is revolving around that. Then, if they want to design their house, they start, say, okay, it's your problem, you can solve it. So build your own house, make models. So when they make models, then also we assist them to, build something like this. They built in this city, they built 38 houses. All the houses are different depending on their on the need and aspirations, but budget may be same. And this community mapping process and this collective process led them to start a collective craft business, because now after they know that this community have this skill and other community does, so they connect themselves and they are making a big business. They're selling it not only in the country but outside. So this actually moved us or gave us courage to ask this question: if this low-income community people can design their community with the assistance of many people, city authority, why can't the city people design their own city? So we again, we sat with this question. We sat in the municipality with many groups, 20, 30 groups of people, children group, education group, sports group, elderly group, women group, street vendors group, all sat together and how can we make our city better? And sometimes we bring other people from other cities and other countries also, friends from other countries, like from our CAN friends, Community Architects Network friends. And we do workshop, 5, 6, 7 days workshop, intense workshop, not in the room, in outside, working hands-on workshop, and people work together. These are architects and non-architects, all are making and designing the cities. The children, their aspiration, their aspiration not only people-centric but also planet-centric. So we get all these things, and we the people, not the architects or planners, professionals, the people, they present it to the city authority. Then city authority, start to, have more confidence that, oh, people can do it actually. They have more, they have more trust on them. So, and eventually, this works, they start to implement many things in the city. We together we say, oh, this is also because the city is also planning that we want to do this, but they think that people cannot do this. So all the responsibilities goes to the, architects and planners. But I think this city making process is very complex. We shouldn't leave this this complex thing to planners only. They will fail. So all together we can do it. So it's kind of we are just moving in between these two diagrams, non-resilient system and the organic system. We tend to be, you know, an organic system, but to start with, we can walk in between these two, and both are needed to do this. I will not go through all this, because maybe in the discussion we will all these questions, you know, how do housing and shelter policies affect social relationship between different groups of people? Then what kind of innovations we are doing? What do you think the role of government and should be in providing housing? I think this, you know, from our experience, we just, you know, try to answer this. You know, we can have the discussion in the question and answer session. And also, what role do you think markets should? I mean, I was, you know, after this question, I was thinking that the market can find ways to empower community-led process, less individual, more collective process. And what do you think the role of NGOs and civil society organizations? It's just we you know, from this process or from this experience, we feel that listening to all groups of people, not, you know, together, you know, age, gender, ability segregated, you know, listening, and then maybe, you know, sharing, and it can be scaled up. So thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Khondaker. That was really fascinating and quite inspiring in terms of the kind of focus around co-production and these kind of things. And I think it opened up, as you said at the end, you know, a series of questions in response to the prompts that Ramona and others have provided. But one of the things that kind of struck me in terms of a bigger question that comes out of this is this question of co-production, and the way that focuses our attention on kind of who owns the city, in effect, who is the city for, you know, and your kind of focus upon the city being the production of its residents, of its denizens, of all of those who kind of do the actual practical work of creating the city through these kinds of creative practices. So it was really fascinating. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that will come back to you on that, partly because it's a really interesting set of, you know, examples that I'm sure other people will have questions about as well. So I'm going to pass on now to our final speaker, and then we'll loop back for some questions at the end. So our final speaker is Nikolaos Vrantsis, who is an independent researcher and a PhD candidate in human geography, based at Uppsala University in Sweden. So I'm going to pass over to you, and yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So I'm going to present the results of a one-year-long field-based work in this neighborhood of Xylatica in Thessaloniki, entitled A Destabilized Property Regime, Social Reproduction Squeeze and Vigilant Violence in West Thessaloniki. To summarize what I'm going to present, I collect data from this year-long field-based work in this neighborhood in central Thessaloniki, and I unravel a vigilant campaign of informal evictions of migrant squatters on behalf of local property owners. I try to contextualize this violence historically and geographically. Historically, I point to the distinct trajectory of the Greek property regime and housing model that is marked by the minimal involvement of state authority and a familistic welfare model, an informal welfare model that emerged as a substitute vis-a-vis this atrophy on behalf of the administration. Then I look into the geographic conditions of possibility that turned Xylatica into a test bed of vigilant violence. And finally, I argue that this kind of violence is linked with the destabilization of the property regime and housing model, the social reproduction squeeze, and the rent gap in Xylatica. The main questions driving this research were twofold. One was, what were the transformations in the Greek political economy that created the conditions of possibility for the emergence of this violence? And the second one is whether this violence can be seen as an indicator of the destabilization of the Greek property regime. So first, I can take you through the distinct trajectory of the Greek regime that is quite exceptional, an outlier when it comes to be compared with other contexts. So what has been described as a neoliberal turn in other, mostly North European contexts, does not constitute a turning point for the Greek case. The later is marked by the strategy, what has been called a strategy of minimal involvement from the state, that did never take active part in the reconstruction process after the war or in the provision of housing for the population. Instead, it supported the population to build their houses by themselves through a technology of aided self-help. So this strategy, this absence, this atrophy of the state was translated into two systems of self-provisioning housing, the system of self-promotion and the system of antiparochi or land for floods. Both of these systems constituted a very effective housing policy for the integration of the urbanizing population without much state spending on infrastructure and welfare. And it also made way for this familistic welfare model, this familistic welfare buffer that emerged as a substitute to the atrophy of the state. So I'm trying to draw this connection, this nexus between familism as an ethical substance, home ownership, and the asset-based welfare of Greece. Where social security of people was decisively dependent on one's position in residential property relations and ownership of assets. The reproduction of this informal welfare relied mainly on the working members of the family and mainly on the figure of the male breadwinner. And there is one very, let's say, indigenous term in Greece called Nikokireos, the householder, who is indicating the significance of this figure of the male breadwinner in tuning the members of the family, using their collective labor and assets in order to make them prosper in life. Now, in this model, owning a home was the organizational and ideological infrastructure limited the effects of social fluidity and downwards mobility. Now, all these are key in order to understand the social reproduction squeeze that followed the financial collapse and the ensuing economic collapse after 2008. After the collapse, the policy prescriptions imposed in Greece by the Troika reduced GDP by about 30%. And the cost of the crisis were outsourced mainly to the institution of the family. Unemployment rates skyrocketed, property taxes sextupled, arrears increased from 4% to more than 45%, and housing costs went through the ceiling. I have this graph here, this figure that you cannot actually see, but it indicates the housing cost overburden and how affected the Greek households are after 2008. So despite the fact that the fulfillments, the material conditions for the fulfillment of housing aspirations downsized, home ownership persists as the aspirational yardstick for securing social safety and for measuring socially recognized success. To sum up what I have presented so far, there is a widening gap between housing aspirations and the material conditions for their fulfillment after the social reproduction squeeze dealt by the crisis. And in order to unravel the side effects of this gap, I turn to this neighborhood of Xylatica, a stigmatized neighborhood in central Thessaloniki, to describe how widespread precarization links with the emergence of violence, on behalf of local property owners against the undocumented migrants. So Xylatica is a stigmatized neighborhood, a repudiated neighborhood in the heart of metropolitan Thessaloniki and in the west side of the central municipality of Thessaloniki. And after the crisis, there was an ebbing of commercial and construction activity that converged with the immigration of people, of migrants and refugees with no access to the formal accommodation options and with no access to the local familistic welfare system. So, however, despite the long-standing stigma of Xylatica, the promise for its upgrading has not withered away. And this is how I place violence. Xylatica being at once a discarded urban zone and marked by a rent gap between current and potential ground value, turned into a testbed where subjects facing social insecurity who find hard to assimilate the resources that would secure their social position, exercise violence against the completely marginalized people in order to increase their chances to enter a safe zone mediated by outright home ownership. This violence that started from a person leading the group converts with the local demand for security from locals who are afraid of the people who are completely marginalized. In order to conclude, I see the instances of vigilant violence as not as spontaneous acts of racism, but something, of course, they are racist, but something much more than that. It's an attempt, an effort of people to defend to correct Xylatica, to normalize Xylatica in order to allow property to yield its full value, expecting symbolic and material value by erasing what they perceived as stigmata that impede their evaluation process. I have one final comment to make related to the research, suggesting that we cannot see these instances as mere facts of racism. We deal with these incidents as phenomena of pure racism, the structural conditions triggering them, we would have missed them. So I suggest that incidents of vigilant violence are messengers of future occurrences in contexts where property and ownership undergo stress. So considering the transformation of in the political economy of urban places in which vigilant violence occurs, and looking into the mediums and processes demarcating ethical subjects compatible with good governance in other contexts would would produce very relevant academic and politically useful research. And this is an invitation to look into vigilance as an indicator of destabilized property regimes. So thank you, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nikolaos. That was really fascinating again. And I think it takes us in slightly different directions as well to the other presentations. So it's useful to have the kind of different perspective, particularly thinking back to Panos's presentation earlier in terms of the Greek case and the kind of varying different ideas. So I think what your presentation has done really nicely is kind of unpack in real detail some of those kind of tensions and violent politics that I think were underpinning Panos's initial discussion of the kind of wider context of this. So I'm kind of conscious of the time that we've got. We've got around about half an hour just for ongoing discussion. So if people in the audience have questions that you want to raise, please feel free to add them to the Q&A discussion at the bottom, and I'll pick those up and pass those on to the panelists. But I just want to spend a couple of minutes just sort of providing a few kind of comments and a few questions directly to a number of the panelists, and then hopefully that will give people in the audience a bit of time to consider their thoughts and questions. So for me, I think there were three things that I wanted to sort of pick up on, or three sort of themes, I suppose, that I think come across quite interestingly through the presentations that we've had. So one of these is around a point that was actually made this morning in the session that was discussing local economies, where I think it was David was talking about the relation between the camp and the city, and these varying different understandings of spatial appropriation and spatial control in different contexts of displacement and crisis. And he was talking there about the way in which there are kind of overspills from accommodation. So if we think about refugee camps in the context that he was talking about, I think it was in Kenya, he was talking about the ways in which those spaces then spill out into other forms of social relations outside and so on. And I was thinking about that in relationship to the varying different ways in which accommodation and housing, in the way that you're looking at, and we've talked about in this panel, sort of spills out into other contexts, and how it has a set of kind of ongoing relationships. And what was interesting was that you were all talking about accommodation and housing, but none of you necessarily were talking about home, either homemaking or the kind of the embodiment of home. So I was thinking about home as one of the ways in which that question of housing spills outwards and kind of connects into other aspects of people's lives, whether that be home or housing as a kind of foundation and basis on which people build security and these kinds of things, all those kind of senses of ownership and property relations and these kind of things. And I think that comes through quite clearly in a lot of what's kind of underpinning some of the political relationships behind these talks. So for example, in Khondaker's talk, we heard about the kind of co-production of space and the value of this community putting into the production of this environment, and how in some ways we could think of that as the production of a collective home or community in some form. But then equally in Nikolaos, I think your focus really nicely on this kind of vigilant violence, I think, is also about an expression of an insecurity about your place within that city, and a kind of a sense of that being under threat, and that violence is in some way seeking security, whether that be through kind of excluding others, or whether that be through trying to secure your own position within an urban society and an urban economy, these kind of things. So I was just thinking about some of those kind of relationships. And then the other two sort of, I suppose, general points that I wanted to make was, one was around this interrelationship between housing and violence. And I think that came through really clearly in Angela's comments, and also in Nikolaos' work, and this sort of sense of the tensions that are underpinning how housing is sought, but also how it leads to a variety of different conflicts and tensions. I've got a couple of questions on that I'll come back to in a moment. And then the third point is around kind of questions of agency and appropriation. And I think this is an issue that has run through a lot of the panels that we've had today in terms of thinking through crisis response and thinking through that relationship between NGO, practitioner, humanitarian organizations that often can be derided as kind of doing things to people rather than with people. And I think that question around agency and appropriation is really interesting to think about in these different kind of contexts. So we have, context of Nikolaos talked at the start there about this kind of idea of housing aspirations and almost the responsibilization of citizens to self-home and to kind of create their own spaces as a response to this, which was in some ways a kind of a false promise. But then you have this notion of co-creating the city through mapping and appropriation and other things. And so I guess I'm quite interested in thinking about what scope there is for that level of agency and appropriation in these different environments. So just to kind of provide a couple of questions, and then we'll I'll hand the floor back to you all. For for Khondaker, I was interested if you could comment in a moment. I'll pose a question to each of you, and then I'll kind of come around to responses. To what forms of sort of barriers, I suppose, you found in this kind of work? So are there barriers from within the community in this city in terms of responding to this question of kind of community work and community sort of co-production? And are there barriers coming institutionally as well? So thinking not just from the community itself, but also from, you know, you had the mayor in that photograph, but are there other kind of institutional contexts that make that work harder than it might otherwise be? And how have you gone about the work of dealing with that? For Angela, it kind of picks up actually a little bit on some of Khondaker's comments. I was interested to know about what kind of forms of freedom or appropriation there are available to the IDPs within this context. You know, you gave these images of quite sort of dystopian kind of environments that are being produced here, really kind of mass production of accommodation in a very marginal kind of space in areas that have been territorially stigmatized. But there was also this sense that at times there was that overspill into forming kind of informal economies and opportunities to try and, you know, do something slightly different here. So I guess, you know, what forms of response have there been? Have there been attempts to try and appropriate that space and to, in some ways, recode it as not simply territorially stigmatized in that way? Have there been, you know, collective or individual efforts to reposition the way that environment is understood? And then for Panos and Nikolaos, I was interested in the kind of relationship between your two talks, really, and the kind of different accounts you were positioning in terms of the kind of Greek case. And so I guess I'm interested to know sort of, you know, where you see these tensions around accommodation and opportunity going. So what's the kind of, you know, this vigilant violence that you're accounting for, Nikolaos? You know, is this a sort of cycle that will reproduce itself, or is there a kind of end point that you see coming potentially through that process? And Panos, do you see those kinds of forms of violence that Nikolaos was talking about in the questions around, you know, the provision of apartment accommodation, these kinds of things? And are they expressed through physical violence or through stigmatization, those kinds of dynamics? So I'm going to leave it there because I realize I've sort of thrown some stuff at you. But I'm going to ask you to maybe respond possibly in the order that I've just asked the question. And then in that time, I'll pick up on some of the comments and questions that we've got in the chat as well. So is that okay with you all? Brilliant. So Khondaker, if you could respond first, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah. What are the challenges, you know, to do this kind of process, especially this co-creation process? As you mentioned also that, you know, the community, they might not be ready, you know, to also the city authority and also the professionals, you know, planners, architects like us. I think the challenge is in our perception first, that it's kind of a perception of or a cycle of, you know, underestimating, you know, that the city authority don't understand us, they will not hear us. And then the city authority also think that, the people will not be able to do this. And the professionals and experts, the city authority and the people, they will not understand this, the theory and understand this process. So, and this happens because all these groups, we don't sit together and discuss this openly. You know, all this, you know, confusion, all this question, you know, we don't. If we sit together and open this discussion, you know, have tea and a relaxed discussion, then all this, because the problem is ours. then okay, you can do this, you can do that. Then suddenly, oh, you are this professional, so maybe you can help in this way. So we think that the main challenge is that we don't sit together, we don't listen deeply to one another, and we always are. That's what we are finding in other cities. In this city, in the city I shared, the culture now is better. That whenever people call, it's not that some are sitting on the chair, some are sitting, So this equal platform, how to do that, and how to listen, by shutting our mouth. That practice is very important. That's the beginning. Then we see that all the groups see that lot of knowledge is already there, lot of wisdom is already there. What we are thinking that bringing these things from outside or bringing this, then we can just, that's what we really feel. And many people say that development is ongoing, or co-creation process is ongoing. It's not that somebody will start it, it's already ongoing. We can just somewhere we can be present and get in and be in the people's process. So that's the challenge. We feel the challenge is from whoever is thinking to work. The challenge is from their side. I teach at the university. I feel that the education system is the biggest challenge. Then whenever I talk with open mind, I talk with the city authority, they say that their system is the challenge. All are saying that their systems are challenged. So why can't we focus more on changing that system, in different places, maybe in the university or in the municipality or in the ministry, then it will be very easy. So because it's for people, all this law, all these things, it will take 2 years to change the law. But when we are working with the people, we are doing it like this, because the people are the lawmakers, and all are with us like a human being, like a citizen of the city. Then they just do it. The way people are living in illegal lands. The people are many things are happening illegally, but we are not, we just close our eyes, some authorities, and it's happening. Whenever they want, they can evict them. But many things what we have been doing is just, we say that if it is not a problem, just close your eyes. And whenever you can fix it, after 2-3 years, you do it. But don't disturb the process, people's process. So this is how we say that first we are human being, then if we sit together as human being with all our identities, then we can solve it by ourselves. Yeah, this is this is the way. Yeah, we do. Thank you. Brilliant,
thanks. There's a couple of other questions for you, but I'm going to move on and we'll come back to those. Thank you. Can I pass over to Angela? Thanks.
Yeah. And thank you, Khondaker, to talk about co-creation and participation, because I think this is a key factor not considering in these projects I show you from free housing. They didn't include the people's opinion, and they just arrived the day they were called to have the key of the house. And you're right, Jonathan, house is not a home. But they are, well, I was doing a cross-case analysis with victims living in informal settlements that have been living there for 10 or more years, building solidarity networks. And right now the university achieved to work together with the municipality with a different approach from social housing, new housing, to informal settlement upgrading for victims of the armed conflict in really nice places of the city, occupied, informally, but with utility networks and possibilities of being legalized. So I think even if in Llano Verde have been emerged social movements internally or NGOs for supporting them, the solidarity networks built there are still weak because they didn't met before the neighborhood was delivered. It's the opposite of the informal settlements, where they met with a common problem and work together to solve it. And in Llano Verde, they didn't have a problem to solve because they received the homes. So the problems came later, and they are solving them, as I show you, in informal practices, informalizing the formal neighborhood to accommodate, and help from the government or NGOs come from like waves. When the teenagers were killed, the president of Colombia was there visiting them and promising that the government will support them more with economic issues and social issues and violence. But after the crisis is replaced by another one in other part of the country or of the city, they come to the 0 point again. And of course, there are a lot of leaders, social leaders, working there to change things. But I think it's not easy when you have 3,500 homes or houses, which means like a small municipality of 30,000 people living together, facing these kind of challenges. They made their effort, but I think it's very, very complicated.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to pass over to Nikolaos now, if that's possible. Thanks.
Yes, thanks so much. And your comments and your summary in these three thematics was brilliant. So about the housing, what fascinates me in this neighborhood, it's like you have buildings and structures where different notions of what a house is overlap and collide, or in some cases synchronize with one another. So you have a building, former, now vacant, but formerly a resident, that is considered, what is it? Is it an object? Is it a commodity? Is it a financial asset? Is it a squat? Is it a refuge for people living in so precarious conditions? Now, what kind of logic is going to prevail? I think this is a political question. It requires a political response. Now, when it comes to the question of whether violence is going to be the future, I would say that the question is, what is the role of the state and the local administration? This is what is interesting in this neighborhood, because most of my interlocutors responded that the role of the state is an enabler of growth. No one actually perceives the state as an actor providing for people in housing precarity. So this self-responsibilization of housing, access to housing, creates these social collisions and in many cases physical violence. So we need to problematize the conceptualization of property and housing, the way we understand housing. And in order to do so, we also need a different administrative approach and that could actually intervene and violate this idea about this monopoly of the conceptual hegemony of the state as an enabler of growth. Yeah. I think that's all from me. Yeah.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting. I could ask many questions on this, but I'm aware there's a couple of other questions. But just one quick point in response. I think it's really interesting you're saying that people were framing the state as an enabler of growth. but not framing the state in any way as a site of any form of provision or any form of guarantee of security. And I think that is quite interesting when we think back to that question of, you know, one of the comments I made was around housing insecurity and this kind of sense of not having security within one's place within society or within the state, those kind of things. And so I think it's interesting that that idea of the state as a traditional body that provides some level of security for its citizens or for those resident is absent from that narrative entirely. I think it's just quite an interesting kind of dynamic. But anyway, I'm not going to kind of go on about that. But Panos, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And I would also agree with Nikolaos that your points were, you know, trying to combine and synthesize from different presentations from so different contexts. I'll stick to your question on the forms of violence with respect to those types of accommodation within, or at least perhaps better in relation to the Greek reception system, starting maybe from some contextual information on regarding the area that Nikolaos' case studies was located, that is also nearby that building perhaps, and along the railway, that's the western entrance or exit from the city, in dozens of abandoned freight trains, wagons that are not used anymore, broken windows and so on. Mostly young migrants find temporary home, whatever this means, in trying to actually not really being excluded from the accommodation provided institutionally by the reception system, but trying to avoid going through the reception system because they intend to reach, you know, to skip it and reach a Northern European destination without being fingerprinted and so on. So that's possibly also adds to the sense of security that vigilant groups maybe react to in that area. I'm not entirely sure, but not want to overimpose, but is also features there. Well, instances of violence, perhaps on a different level, but instances of violence have been observed, especially with respect to island-based hotspots, camps essentially, as well, particularly on Lesbos, but not alone. Partly reacting to the prolonged containment of asylum seekers there. Numbers have been lately reduced in very dubious accelerated procedures in the last year or so, but and they're now overall in the 5 islands no more than 5,000, perhaps even less at the moment, but they at some point exceeded 42,000 people. Consider, for instance, beginning of 2020, over 20,000 of people being in Lesbos alone, a place with 80,000 population overall. Yeah, and I think a side effect relates to some of the overspills. Perhaps you talked before, could have been the economies around in relation to the camp, and to what extent and which parts of the local community benefits and how it does so. So there's also a political economy view that could add to the explanation of violent reactions. But there have been also vigilant groups and racist attacks, and to both asylum seekers as well as volunteers and activists and people working for NGOs and so on. As far as mainland camps are concerned, well, I couldn't generalize for the so many, but small as compared to, you know, the global south situation, but they've exceeded 30 until a few months ago. There are 27 or 88, I mean, structures labeled as camps across the country at the moment. The incidents I have in mind, or I've seen studies about, mostly perceive reactions to a new settlement, to the government decision of installing without any consultation a new camp in an area. And their racism can be also perceived as, or, you know, not mere narcissism, but very much in accordance to how Nicola has put it, but perhaps NIMBY-like, not in my backyard-like reactions could also feed the picture. But as far as urban accommodation, at least through the official STIA program is concerned, there have been only isolated incidents of, tensions to my knowledge. And despite, I mentioned generically rather problems and deficiencies, one of which could have been the lack of, to refer to some of the keywords you mentioned, and Angela and Khondaker related to, and with respect to their presentations of co-creation or participation. There was not anything like that. There were top-down decisions, people relations, even with, beneficiaries, yeah, even with landlords or services were mediated by NGO workers or project workers, social workers, and others. So they were dependent in a sense. But even so, this allowed some form of space for participation in urban life, which I think is essential, and probably also played a role for the non-occurrence in that case of widespread, violent tensions or anything like that. And obviously I left outside, but it's still there, even limited, and despite the crackdown since at least 2019, the solidarity squads that had emerged perhaps already since 2015, not just in Athens, but also in Thessaloniki, which may not concern that many people as a few years ago, but are still the case. And there's some space for co-creation, although at a very precarious level. Yeah, that's also to be noted. And I'll perhaps leave my response there.
Thank you. So we've got a few minutes left, and there's a few questions that have emerged from our audience. So I'm going to sort of abuse our time a little bit and maybe overspill by 5 minutes just to ensure that we can cover these questions.
Jonathan, you can take more than 5 minutes. That's okay. It's a really.
Well, I was being optimistic.
Okay.
We may take 10, but yeah. So I'm gonna run through these questions, and then I'll go through them all, and then we'll have a second round of responses if that's okay. I think that's probably going to be the most efficient way to do this. So in the questions, there's a question to Nikolaos around how do you in effect kind of prove or demonstrate the structural drivers of vigilant violence. So studies of motivations of vigilant violence might rely on interview responses and evidence of violent acts that are visible, but how do you kind of build the kind of evidence of a policy or political dynamic that's driving vigilant violence? Do people say they're committing violence to protect the value of their housing or housing prices, these kind of things? So there's a question here, I suppose, around the evidential basis for linking particular acts to this kind of process. Then there's a question for Angela. So in Colombia, what might be the challenges and drawbacks of taking the opposite approach of trying to disperse temporary housing for victims throughout a city rather than concentrating in pockets where housing is less expensive? Could it be more difficult for districts or municipalities to manage and could it create different kinds of stigma or isolation? And this also kind of connects, I think, quite nicely to a question that I think Romola posed, which was around whether the kind of IDP schemes that we see here are kind of creating almost a form of encampment for IDPs, but kind of termed differently in some ways, particularly thinking about the lack of green space, these kinds of things. And then finally, there's a question for Khondaker in terms of the co-creation process. So how do you ensure that individuals marginalized within communities, thinking about LGBTQ plus individuals or religious minorities, for example, how are they able to exercise their right to create the city and to be part of that co-production process, particularly if the communities that may be excluding them are the ones who are maybe at the forefront of doing co-production, if you see what I mean. So especially this might be the case when their ideas for the city are opposed to dominant ideas held by the community. That's one of the points that the questioner asks. And similarly, in the chat, Romola was kind of asking a question here around the nature of participation. So how do you ensure kind of equitable forms of participation, and who, I suppose, determines the grounds and the basis on which participation is taking place in these co-production relationships? So some interesting kind of questions, some big and kind of meaty topics. So if we go around in the order that I've kind of posed those, so if Nikolaos, if you could go first, and then once we've done that, I'll kind of wrap up and pass back to Romola. Thank you.
Thanks for this great question. And my research relies mainly on interviews with local people and ethnographic work. But I try to make this, I try to contextualize this. I saw the decrease, the administrative decrease on the land uses and the change in the land uses during the last decades. I also tried to see what the vision of the local administration and the central government is in regards to the development of the neighborhood. I also try to identify the synchronization in the words and the grammar used by my interlocutors with this vision of for the neighborhood coming top down. So I created this order of promise. I was saying that vigilance is not something that comes as a protective tool of an ideal community of the past, but as something that is geared towards the future, something to yield that is essential, a ritual to clear the area and re-normalize it in order to allow it to yield profit. And I created this order of promise makers. So first comes the state by providing incentives, tax reductions, and then comes the local administration that is leasing buildings for investors. And you have investors coming, big capital, of course, who are investing in the neighborhood. Panos is probably aware of this, Alumil or Cisco or Demand, big capital that have a vision of creating a commercial hub in the neighborhood. And then you have building promoters who start rebuilding again, and property owners who try to join the bandwagon of development by exercising resort to violence in many cases. So this is the way that I approached it. But in order to complement the comment of Panos, it's important to note that this is a vigilant campaign that started in 2017 but succeeded in 2019, and this is not accidental, because you had the election of a new government promising a restoration of normality in the country, and the crackdown on the Solidarity Network as part of this restoration of normality was crucial. So they created the conditions of legitimation of these vigilantes to remain unpunished despite their exercise of violence against squatters. Yeah. I hope I responded to the question.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass to Angela now. Thanks.
Okay, yes, it's a good question, because I think housing response for IDPs that arrive to city must address multiple strategies, not only one. And the concentration in the city, I think it's possible and much better. I mentioned in the presentation that the free housing program only covers 7% of the IDP living in Cali. So there are still many people to be integrated into housing programs right now. For example, support with lease payments or helping them to purchase the homes where they currently live could help a lot. But subsidies for IDPs in Colombia are only for new houses. So I think the government have to is currently changing this formula, because they can't afford new houses and they can't have a mortgage in the bank. So second-hand houses could be a good idea, but also informal settlement and upgrading, including security of tenure of properties, and because many of them have their solidarity networks very consolidated in these settlements, as mentioned, and government programs should not disarticulate these networks, but contribute to strengthen them. So I think it's a good idea and a good solution if it can be deconcentrated and address different forms of helping them. I will say that.
Thank you. And finally, Khondaker, you wanted to finally respond. Thanks.
Yeah. The question is very good, and it's always, I think, we try to reach the hard to reach people first. Like when we work in a city, then we start from the disadvantaged or the powerless people. So who are powerless people? Who are invisible people? So if we just start with them, then the other things are very easy. And we cannot invite all and try to find out the outcome. It's not that. We need to sit with different groups in different time, or I mean separately. Like when we are sitting with children group, it's the children group. When we are sitting with this differently abled or physically challenged groups, or so in different groups we need to sit. Like in many groups I cannot. Sometimes I am not allowed there. Like many women group, then you are just, I'm not allowed because I am a man. And especially now we have been working in the refugee camp in Myanmar. Refugees are here, Rohingya camp. So culturally they are very shy. I mean, especially the women group, they are very shy to talk with men. So it all depends on who are there to take the information or gather the information or gather the knowledge. It's completely depend on that person or that group of people. So this is how actually we work. Another thing is that it's not that we go and discuss and find it out. We need to find out the method, that in which method we will discuss, and it should be designed, and through experience we can find it out which would be the direction of this method. it depends on, maybe we did somewhere, then we don't know this is not working, then this should be the method. And in all this method, one thing we found out that it shouldn't be just talking and getting information. It should be through some action. And that action could be drawing, model making, or something, maybe, cooking together, or anything, we need to find out what is the appropriate for that group. And that actually makes these two groups in an equal platform to have that discussion. And another thing is that most of the time we perceive or imagine that what the other want from us, and it is kind of from our left brain we act, the logical part. But we can design in such a way so that our right brain become activated, and we felt that the drawing is very drawing exercise is a very quick method to actually open up this type of discussion and go very deep into emotional part of and when we touch each other by heart, then it becomes, then we are touching like human being, not like an architect or planner or poor people or rich people. So I think it's all we can ask ourselves that what we want to do, then we can find the way. If we just ask ourselves, then we find the way. Thank you. There are many methods. We can just take any method depending on, because maybe I can listen, I can talk, I can then maybe the outcome is in some way different from other people. If someone is very friendly, very then it will be better than me. So it all depends on who is interacting with who. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think your kind of positive words about the kind of possibilities of working together and collaboration there, I think are a nice place to sort of bring this discussion to a close. I just want to say a couple of words just before handing back to Romola. So firstly, I think this session has been really valuable in terms of highlighting a couple of points that actually were made right at the start of the discussion this morning, which was around this workshop and urban crises and trying to pick up on the complexities of cities, but also the complexities of how crises emerge in cities and how crises are dealt with in and through cities. And I think we've seen that complexity when we take housing as a kind of starting point. I think what these talks have highlighted to us is that, we've been talking about housing, but we haven't focused solely upon housing, and actually that's been a kind of jumping off point to explore the complexities of various different issues, whether that be participatory processes of co-production or questions about violence and insecurity and these kinds of dynamics and the role of the state in imposing accommodation of different forms on different groups, and also the kind of layering of different forms of historical property relations, stigma, and so forth. So I think we've got some sense of that kind of complexity. I don't think we've necessarily scratched the surface of the multiple different crises that are going on underpinning all of your talks, but we're never going to do that in one session, if indeed we would ever be able to do that in one lifetime, to be honest. So I think we've kind of touched on a variety of different perspectives here, and hopefully had some valuable conversations for you as contributors. I just wanted to end by thanking you all so much for your time this afternoon and for your really valuable contributions. I know that I hopefully speak for all of our audience in just thanking you wholeheartedly for all the work that you've put into this and for all your kind of thoughts, and hopefully this will be the start of a kind of ongoing set of conversations between you and the other organisers as well. So thank you very much. We can't obviously do a kind of collective round of applause, but we could if we would. And I'm going to pass back now to Romola just to kind of conclude things for the day. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Again, I want to just echo what Jonathan was saying. This was such an interesting session. I've learned so much. I had so many questions to ask, and I just found all the presentations so incredibly rich. Thank you very, very much for that very stimulating close to the day.